LeBron James to Philly. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last 2 weeks, or you've just remained on your Eagles high bender and you haven't come down and tried to focus on the other Philadelphia sports yet, that's been the mantra over the last 2 weeks in Philadelphia sports, is LeBron James to Philly. Hello, everybody, and welcome into another Trust the Podcast episode. I'm your host, Tyler Zulli. Thanks so much for joining us here today. We're going to get away from the Eagles, I promise you. There will be no Eagles talk today on this Trust the Podcast episode. We're going to talk Sixers. We're going to talk Flyers. We'll talk some Phillies baseball as well to wrap things up. But I promise you, we're not going to dive too much in to this LeBron James talk. Yes, there's been rumors that LeBron James had some representatives visit Malvern Prep the other day to scout it out in the outcome that LeBron James decides that he's going to sign with the Philadelphia 76ers. But here's the thing. I guarantee you, LeBron had representatives in every single city in which there's a possibility that he may be coming to play at next season. He didn't need them in Cleveland. If he stays in Cleveland, the kids will stay at school. And this is really what it's about. It's all about his kids. If he stays in Cleveland, he doesn't need them. But I'm sure if that rumor is true, that the representatives at were at Malvern Prep, they were probably also at a prep school in San Antonio. They were at a prep school in Miami. They were at a prep school in San Francisco when he visited the Golden State Warriors. There are going to be these representatives everywhere, so don't buy too much into that. However, if you want to buy into the fact that LeBron James is the culmination of the process, that I can buy. Now, I know you guys know I've gone on the record and said I'm not a huge proponent, a huge advocate, I should say, of the idea of the process. I thought it was a little bit of a gimmick. I thought it was a little bit of a shtick to lose intentionally, to get players down the road. That's something you do in a video game. That's something you say, oh, I'm going to inherit the Sixers on 2K, and I'm going to trade all of my best players, and we're going to win 10 games a year for 4 years, and we're going to stockpile draft picks, and then we're going to win the league every single year for 15 seasons. You know how I know that? Because I've done that. I've done that on 2K. Now, granted, it's an older one, so I was trading guys away like Andrew Bynum. But that's the point. That's the point of the video games, is to make your franchise good for 30 years. That's not the point of real-life basketball. The point of real-life basketball is to grow naturally through the draft process while continuing to build with veteran players. However, that's not the initiative that the Sixers have taken. And at this point, at this juncture, my thoughts on the process, they don't matter. Because at the end of the day, the process happened. It's not going to go away. And the Sixers are probably better off for it. But here's the thing about the process. The process was always twofold. It was never simply to continually stockpile draft picks and just say, oh, well, we're going to stink for 10 years and we're going to get 10 number one picks. And then by the time that 10th rookie comes in, we're good to go. The point was to stink for a couple of years and get a couple of key pieces, which they have. They've invested in Joel Embiid. They have Ben Simmons running the point. If Markelle Fultz can wrap his head around the fact that he needs to revamp his shot, they've got themselves a shooting guard and a backup point guard. Those were the key young draft pieces that the Sixers needed. That part of the process is over. Now it's phase 2 of the process. And phase 2 of the process began with Marco Bellinelli signing with the Philadelphia 76ers. When he was released from his contract earlier in the year, Marco Bellinelli had a chance to sign with whatever team that he pleased. And he chose the Sixers. He chose the Sixers because he realized two things. He realized that, A, he's going to get to play, because the Sixers had an opportunity with guys down and guys injured for Marco Bellinelli to immediately step into the offense and contribute. You saw it against the Miami Heat when there was no Joel Embiid, and Marco Bellinelli stepped up and put in double-digit points. But he signed because he knew he was going to play, and he liked what he saw building in Philadelphia, and he wanted to be a part of that process. You could joke around and see what he put on Twitter with a picture of Rocky running with his face on there, saying trust the process. And when he was asked why he signed with Philadelphia, he said, because I trusted the process. He was the beginning of phase 2. Now, Marco Bellinelli is not this world-beating, game-changing player that the Sixers are going to look at and go, he was the reason we won the NBA Finals. But Marco Bellinelli is the reason that the process moved into phase 2. He was the beginning of phase 2. And what phase 2 now starts is the culmination of 5 really long and arduous years. And we now look at it and go, it's time to bring in the free agent names. It's time to bring in that one superstar that is going to be paired with Joel Embiid, with Ben Simmons, with Dario Saric, with Markelle Fultz, if he can get on the court. You bring in that one established veteran superstar, and you make this thing work. You finally put together a team that could get over the hump. Because this team right now, this team that is playing at the pace that they're playing at, and by the way, that pace is pretty unbelievable right now. They've won 12 straight at the Wells Fargo Center. They've won 7 straight overall. They're 31-25 now. They're a team that has come together at the right time and continue to climb the ladder of the back end of the playoff teams in the Eastern Conference. But you put that talent like LeBron James in Philadelphia, and it doesn't have to be LeBron James. That's just the name that jumps out. It could be LeBron James. It could be Paul George. There are a handful of guys that would be the perfect fit for Philadelphia to get them to the next level. Because this team right now is built to be a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8 seed. This team is built to maybe win a series should they be the 5 seed and play the Washington Wizards. Should they be the 5 seed and play the Milwaukee Bucks. I think they could beat both of those teams. I think they would beat them in a series and advance to the second round. Now, should they play Toronto? Should they play Boston? Should they play Cleveland? They're not ready to beat those teams yet. Because very few of the guys on the Sixers roster have any playoff experience, and most of them have absolutely zero playoff experience, including your 2 best players. So they're not ready at this current juncture to beat one of those top 3 teams. But they're building. They're in the continual process, and you're going to hear that word 50,000 times today on this episode. They're in the continual process of getting better. You go from a team that a few years ago won 9 games. Last year they won 28. This year, they already have 30-plus wins. They should easily be over 500. They should at least win 42 games, bare minimum. And if you break down the schedule of the 2 halves, it's almost a tale of 2 seasons. And I know that they're not directly half and half. They're not 41-41. But you can call the All-Star game the unofficial middle of the season. You end the first half, you begin the second half. And in the first half, the Sixers were 30-25, with one of a top 5 hardest schedules in all of the NBA. The last 27 games, the Sixers play 15 teams under 500. They play the Charlotte Hornets 3 times. They play the Brooklyn Nets twice. They still have to play the Knicks once. They get the Atlanta Hawks twice. They played the Orlando Magic last night and beat them. They played the Chicago Bulls a couple of nights ago and looked like they were dead to rights. They had no right to be in this game, or in that game, I should say. But at the end of the game, they win the game with the fact that only 2 players played well. Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons were the only ones that had good games. The rest of the team struggled. J.J. Redick didn't even look like he was on the court at times, but he was. Those were games that in years past the Sixers would have folded up and died. They would have said, well, this game's over. We'll chalk this one up as a loss. We'll move on to the next game. But this year's team did not do that. This year's team battled back, just like they battled back against Miami to end the unofficial first half of the season without Joel Embiid. This team is different. And this team's not different in win a championship different, but this team is different in grit. This team is different in determination. This team is different in the way that they play the game to a point where they are almost a contender. They're a contender on a nightly basis. And they're a contender to, like I said, maybe beat a Washington or a Milwaukee in the first round. But this team is going to give the Boston Celtics, the Cleveland Cavaliers, or the Toronto Raptors some issues in the playoffs. They're not going to be a 4-0 deficit. They're not going to get swept. Any team that they play, this series is going 6, at least. Because you know the Wells Fargo Center is going to be packed when this team steps onto the floor for the first time in playoff fashion in 6 years. And let's really be honest, if you really take a look at it, that team that went to the Eastern Conference semifinals, the team that upset the Chicago Bulls as an 8 seed, if you put those two teams together, this year's team and that team, this year's team would wipe the floor with that team. They would, if you put them in a 7-game series, it would probably not go more than 5. That's the point I'm trying to make, is the fact that this is a team that is different. And they are going to be different for a very, very long time. And when you look at this team on paper, they are one true superstar away from being an NBA Finals contender. And they are 2 players away from winning the whole thing. And when I say 2 players, I don't mean 2 superstars. You don't need LeBron and Paul George. But if you get LeBron and you get another draft pick, you've got yourself a team. You've got yourself a team that compete at the NBA Finals level, not at a playoff level, not at a 500 level, at the NBA Finals level for the next 5 years at least. And you've got the salary cap to do it. Joel Embiid gets paid next year big for the first time. Ben Simmons is still on his rookie deal next year. Markelle Fultz is still on his rookie deal next year. The likelihood of J.J. Redick coming back, if you were to sign LeBron, is very slim. So there's $20 million off the books. They have the financial freedom to make this team work for quite a long time. Take a look at the Golden State Warriors. The likelihood of them losing Klay Thompson is very, very high. Kevin Durant's on a max deal. Steph Curry's on a max deal. Draymond Green's got to get paid at some point. The likelihood that they do not re-sign Klay Thompson is extremely high. But they've had their run of now 5 years of being an NBA Finals contender. Why? Because they put together a big core and they won a championship and then they added Kevin Durant. Now, the thing is, they won their championship first, but their core came together more quickly than the Sixers has. But they're not that different. And if you're going to tell me that you're going to give me 5 years of NBA Finals contention, I'll take it. If you give me 5 years of NBA Finals contention, then the process was a success, and I will go eat crow. I will go tell you that I was wrong, because I'm not too ashamed to tell you I was wrong. I do it all the time because I'm wrong all the time. You would think that I shouldn't have a job in this industry, but somehow I do. Like I told you, I was wrong about the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Like I said that I was wrong about Lane Johnson when they drafted him because I wanted Deion Jordan. Like I was wrong. Well, actually, I was right about Dominic Brown, but that's a different story for a different time. We'll get to that at another time. But I will tell you that I was wrong if the process succeeds, because clearly it was the right mindset and it was the right way to produce. Because I tell people this all the time. The worst place to be in sports is what I like to call sports purgatory. Because if you're good, you're good. Go and try to compete. Grab another superstar. Go win championships. And if you're so monumentally bad that you're the Sixers from the last few years, you're the Cleveland Browns, you're what the Miami Marlins are doing this year, then go ahead and go and get your draft picks. Stock up on your draft picks and get better over time. Get young talent, let them play, develop them, and then turn them into superstars. But being in that middle ground is the worst place to be. And that's where the Sixers found themselves for a majority of the 2000s. In between the AI campaign and this team. And you talk about the process. So the AI campaign and the beginning of the process, the Sixers were perennially in the playoffs. Now, that doesn't mean that they were a great basketball team, because if you remember, the East was garbage for years. But they were perennially in the playoffs as a 7 or an 8 seed. Right around 500, right below, right above, and they'd get bounced in the first round. Sure, they had the Chicago Bulls year. It happened. Derrick Rose going down to injury in a meaningless second game was the cause of that. The Bulls would have swept the Sixers had that not happened. But that's the point. They were average at best. And average begets average. You take a look at a team that wins 41 games. Okay, they had a successful year. They went 500. They made the playoffs. Maybe they're building. But for a team like the Sixers in the mid and late 2000s and into the 2010s, they weren't building anything. They made the trade for Bynum. They tried to get over the hump. It didn't work. That was fine with me. But prior to that, the teams that were making the playoffs were getting mid-round picks and not doing anything with them. They were drafting Thaddeus Youngs. They were drafting guys that simply could not compete at the NBA level, at the level that you needed them to be first-round picks. So if you're going to talk about the process and the culmination of the process, this is phase 2 right now. This is what the Sixers strove for in 2012 when they began the trading off and cutting and subsequent tanking of the franchise to get to this point. And like I said, if it becomes a franchise that wins a championship, I will happily eat my words. Because I hated the process. I thought it was the worst idea in the world. Because I hate losing. I'm such a competitor. Even at a level of watching the teams that I root for compete and playing in leagues that are, for guys that couldn't play at the collegiate and professional level. I am such a competitor that I hate losing more than I love winning. And the fact that a team was openly willing to lose, openly willing to tank, frustrated me. But it gets you to this point, and it wins you a championship. And a coworker of mine's Twitter bio is something along the lines of, trust the process, but it must yield a championship. And must is in capital letters. Because he's correct. The process must yield a championship for it to be successful, because otherwise it's just a team that lost intentionally for no reason. And I got a little derailed here about the process, but what I really want to encapsulate in this 45 minutes to an hour is the fact that LeBron James coming to Philly is what the Sixers need. And it doesn't have to be LeBron. Just that superstar is what the Sixers need. And I've heard a lot of people talking over the last week about how it wouldn't be homegrown. I don't want LeBron because it doesn't mean as much if it's not the guys that our team drafted and cultivated and brought along. Here's the thing. At the end of the day, a championship is a championship. I don't care how you come about it. I don't care if it was all homegrown guys and Joel Embiid or Ben Simmons is the finals MVP, or LeBron James and Paul George get you over the hump. Because I don't care if you win the championship, that's all that matters to me. If you win the NBA Finals, if you win the Super Bowl, the Stanley Cup, the World Series, I do not care how it comes about. Do you think we would have cared had the four aces got it done? That the fact that Cole Hamels was the only quote-unquote homegrown arm? They traded for Roy Halladay. They re-signed Cliff Lee. They traded for Roy Oswalt. They traded for Joe Blanton. I don't know if you guys remember that, but Joe Blanton was a trade piece. He's not a local guy. Wasn't a farm system guy. Traded him from the A's. But nobody cared about that when Joe Blanton hit a home run in the 2008 World Series. Nobody cared about that when the Phillies won 100 and something games. And now, granted, that didn't yield a championship, but nobody cared. You know why? Because they won a championship in 2008. And nobody cared because they were trying to win a championship again. So I don't know if it's the stigma of LeBron James himself or what, but at the end of the day, all I want is for my team to win a championship. And if that is the case, that is all that matters to me. So bring in LeBron, bring in Paul George, it doesn't matter. All I want to see is the Sixers win a championship and get to the NBA Finals. And if LeBron James is the culmination of part 2 of the process, that's fine. Marco Bellinelli started it. Actually, Sam Hinkie started it, but we won't go into that charade because people don't like to talk about that. At least the front office of the Sixers don't like to talk about that. Sam Hinkie started it. LeBron James is going to finish it. That's cool with me. Let's step aside for a little bit. On the other side, we'll flip gears a little bit. We'll talk some Flyers hockey. At the end of the show, we'll talk some Phillies baseball as well, as spring training has just gotten underway. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be right back. This is Trust the Podcast. Peter Mrazek to Philly. Thanks so much for hanging back out with us once again. This is Trust the Podcast. I'm Tyler Zulli. You know, we started the show with a hypothetical LeBron James to Philly. Now let's move on to a reality and the fact that Peter Mrazek did, in fact, join the Philadelphia Flyers. Maybe out of necessity. Well, not maybe out of necessity. Absolutely out of necessity. After Brian Elliott goes down, 2 weeks later, Michael Neuvirth goes down. You're basically pigeonholed into a corner in making a deal for a goaltender that, while has his ups and downs, is in fact a good goaltender when he's on. You really didn't have to make the move for. Would Brian Elliott or Michael Neuvirth not gotten injured, both of them at the same time? Had one been injured, you ride the other one with Alex Lyon as the backup until the other returns. But with both injured, you have to go and get a starting goaltender to compete at the NHL level, especially come crunch time. Because you can't ride Alex Lyon the entire way. The kid has very little experience. He's played well in certain games. He's been poor in others. So he has no track record of being a proven NHL goalie. So you have to go out and get a guy like Peter Mrazek, which, by the way, side note here, I know that the Red Wings were not necessarily in need of Mrazek's services. Jimmy Howard's their goaltender. He's been good for the last 5 or 6 years now. But I think that the Flyers really got a steal with Mrazek. It's very incentive-laden is the trade that they made. Obviously, the more starts that he makes, the more playoff starts that he makes into next year, the more expensive the deal gets, but it's all draft picks. And nothing becomes better than a second-round pick. So you're really looking at a guy that you gave up a second-round pick and a third-round pick at the worst for a starting quality goaltender. And that's if he plays well. So if you get yourself a playoff-caliber goaltender for a second and a third-round pick, I don't think you have an issue with it. Now, the issue is going to become when the Flyers have a plethora of goalies, say Neuvirth and Elliott both come back healthy at the same time, and you have Peter Mrazek. Who do you turn to in the playoffs, which we'll get to in a moment? Who do you turn to in the playoffs when you really ride one goalie for an entire playoff campaign? If Mrazek is played the best, say Mrazek goes on and wins 70% of his started games, 80% of his started games for the remainder of the season, does Peter Mrazek remain your starting goaltender into the playoffs because he's hot? Or do you go back to Brian Elliott, who earlier in the year, when healthy, was the sole reason that the Flyers were having any little bit of success when they were hanging right around 500 because they weren't getting any secondary scoring? They weren't getting anything past Claude Giroux and Sean Couturier, and it was making things extremely difficult. And I should add Jake Voracek's assist in there. He hasn't scored a ton of goals, but he is 10th in the league in points. You weren't getting a lot out of anybody else besides those three players. Now Nolan Patrick has come along. Now Travis Konechny's come along. You've got guys that have started to pick up momentum, and they are winning because of them. But in the early part of the season, it was Brian Elliott, and Brian Elliott alone, that was winning the Flyers any sort of games in the early part of 2017-2018 season. So do you ride Mrazek if he's hot, or do you go back to Elliott regardless? See, because if you have Mrazek not play well and they get into the playoffs still, which it looks like they should, they are 1 point out of the first place in the Metropolitan Division with a game in hand over the Pittsburgh Penguins. So they should be a playoff team because of the fact that after the top three teams in the Atlantic Division, it's not a good division. So the Metro's probably going to put out 5 teams. So should you get in, do you turn to Mrazek or do you go back to Elliott if he's healthy? And that really all depends on Peter Mrazek's play over the next couple of weeks. Because he can determine his own playoff status by his play over the next couple of days. If he plays well, he should be the goalie. You don't turn to a guy that's coming off the injured list, off the disabled list, in favor of a guy who has played well. And we all know goaltending is about streaky, consistent play. Streaky or consistent play, I should say. Because goalies are creatures of habit. Goalies and closers are some of the weirdest human beings on the planet. But when they're successful and things are going well, they ride this endorphin high. And they are different players than they are when things are not going well for them. And because of that, you're looking at a goalie that if he plays well, you stick with him. But let's take a look at this Flyers team as a whole, because they are doing something that I don't think any of us predicted. Jamie may have predicted it, one of our lead Flyers writers, because he is your overtly positive Flyers writer. Whereas I am probably one of the most negative writers and broadcasters Philly Sports Network has, Jamie has always been on the opposite end of the spectrum, where he is extremely positive in everything that the Flyers do. So he may have predicted this success and this team coming along and the young players producing as they should. Like I mentioned, TK earlier, Nolan Patrick coming along. The young defensive core has been significantly better in the last month of play than they were early in the season. And that may lead to why the Flyers are giving up far fewer goals in the second half of the season than they did in the first half. At least goals average allowed, per game status. But not many of us would have said this team is going to lose not one but 2 goalies. Wayne Simmons is going to go down for an extended period of time. And they're just going to continue to rattle off wins. 9-0-1 in their last 10 games. So that means they've grabbed 19 out of possible 20 points. And the only point that they did not pick up was in a overtime loss against the New Jersey Devils. A game that they probably should have won and kind of let slip through the cracks. So really, you're looking at a team that, had it won that game against New Jersey, is 10-0 in its last 10 games and is 20 points better than what they were 10 games ago. A team that's in the mid to upper 70s in points, continuing to go on a point run. They got a win last night over the Ottawa Senators, 5-3. And the trade deadline's coming up. Now, by the time that this podcast gets out over the airwaves and over all of our outlets, including YouTube and Twitter and at phillysportsnetwork.com, the trade deadline will have passed. So there's really no sense in me getting into trade deadline talk because it'll be a moot point by the time that this gets out to you. The Bruins have made a move to acquire Rick Nash. The Penguins picked up Derek Brassard. The New Jersey Devils also made a move. And the New York Rangers are trading everybody that they possibly can for younger talent. And I think if you look at that Rick Nash move to Boston, the Rangers made out like bandits. And I'll get to that part in a second and kind of equate this to what the Flyers could do. And obviously this is all, like I said, hypothetical, because by the time this gets out to you, the trade deadline will have passed. But the big name on the trade block, for what it's worth, has been Erik Karlsson. And the Flyers need to get Erik Karlsson because he's a defenseman that can score and do all this great stuff. But let me put this to you this way. The Boston Bruins just acquired Rick Nash for an NHL player, a top-tier prospect, and a 2018 first-round pick. For a guy that has really not produced at the level of Rick Nash ability. Rick Nash is on the downturn of his career. He's also a guy who's never scored more than 80 points. So even at his prime, he was only scoring 70-something points a year. That probably has something to do with the fact that he was often injured and played for really bad Columbus teams over the years. But you got an NHL player, a top-tier prospect, and a first-round pick for Rick Nash. And every single person around the NHL spectrum would tell you that Erik Karlsson at this point in his career is a far better player than Rick Nash. So baseline, you're looking at an NHL player, a top-tier prospect, and a first-round pick. And Ottawa has said they want offensive help. So, in reality, who are you looking to give up? Because it really, what it comes down to is, and this is the offer that really came to my mind and came to others' minds that I've spoken to over the last couple of days, the trade would be, at baseline, Travis Konechny, Travis Sanheim, and a first-round pick. Now, I'm not this oracle of hockey like, some of our guys are. They are far more knowledgeable in hockey than I am. You guys know my forte is baseball and college football, but I like to dabble in the NHL as well. But even someone like myself, who is not the most well-versed hockey fan in the world, knowledgeable enough, knows that giving up Travis Konechny and Travis Sanheim and a first-round pick for Erik Karlsson, who would be here for a year and a half, he's not a total rental as he is on contract for next year, but he'd be here for a year and a half, is a total halt of everything that Ron Hextall has tried to do over the last 3 years. And everything that we know about Ron Hextall leads us to believe that a trade will not be made past the Peter Mrazek deal. So, again, this is all hypothetical because the trade deadline will have elapsed by the time that this gets out to you likely. But what I really want to just kind of hammer home is the fact that the Flyers are in a spot, much like the Sixers, to kind of break the wall down. Break that championship wall down. Now, that's not to say that they're going to climb through the wall and get to the next level. But the Flyers and Sixers have been building and building and building. And when I say building, I mean they're building a metaphorical hammer to break the wall down. And they had the hammer in place now to break that wall down and start to get to the other side. There's going to be a battle on the other side of the wall, but they're equipped at this point to get there and break the wall down. And we had a conversation the other day, me and a couple of coworkers, of who is which team is closer to championship contention. And on the surface, it seems that the Sixers are closer than the Flyers to championship contention. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you say that the Sixers are more talented, that is 100% a certainty at the top of the list. Because Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons are both, I think, higher up in the terms of rebuilding than any of the young talent that the Sixers or that the Flyers have. However, the Flyers' veteran talent is significantly better than the Sixers' veteran talent at this current juncture. And that makes the Flyers, I think, more ready to win a championship at this current spot than what the Sixers are. Take a look at the matchups, and I talked about the Sixers matchups and who they could beat, who they couldn't beat. Milwaukee, Washington, Indiana, Miami. Those are the 4 teams that I think the Sixers, who are the teams that are currently in playoff contention, the Sixers could beat. Now, 2 of those it's going to be very unlikely to see a matchup with unless one of them falls significantly and the Sixers make a big rise into the top 3. The Raptors, the Celtics, and the Cavs, I don't believe they're ready to beat yet. But take a look at the Flyers. You're looking at the teams in the Eastern Conference playoffs standings as it were right now. It's the Flyers and the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Pittsburgh Penguins who kind of headline the 2 divisions. The Lightning headline the Atlantic. It's the Flyers and the Penguins right there battling for the Metropolitan. Those are 3 teams. Then you have the Columbus Blue Jackets at 4. That's a 4th team. That's the team that's currently in 8th place right now. They have 67 points. The only team in all of the playoffs to not have at least 70 points to this point. Then you have the Boston Bruins, who made a trade for Rick Nash, as we talked about, to try to bolster their offense. You have the Toronto Maple Leafs, who are also an 80-point team. And then you look at the Washington Capitals, and it's blanking on me right now who is the 8th team. I'll think about that when I get back to it. Somebody listening right now is shouting this out, like, you moron, how do you not know who the 8th team is? But those are your 7 teams who are competing for a playoff spot right now, or who are in playoff spots right now. Other than Tampa Bay, who scares you to the point where it's like, nope, the Flyers can't win that matchup, can't beat them, not going to happen? Who bothers you out of those other 6 teams and the one non-mentioned team that for some reason is slipping my mind? Toronto doesn't necessarily bother me, despite the fact that they're young and fast and skilled. The Capitals, you know what the Capitals do in playoff time, and until otherwise noted, we're just going to chalk that up as nothing. The Penguins are a worry. The Penguins are a worry despite the fact that the Flyers have had the Penguins' number over the last few years. They worry me come playoff time. They are Stanley Cup threats every single year, as made mention by the fact that they've won 2 in recent memory and 3 in the last 10 years. But Toronto doesn't worry me. Washington doesn't worry me. Columbus doesn't bother me, even though Bob has been, again, sensational this year. It's the Penguins and the Lightning that worry me. Boston doesn't bother me, although they've played well, too. They've traded for Rick Nash in favor of getting rid of Ryan Spooner, who, by the way, only has 3 less points than Rick Nash does. So you traded a guy that has 3 less points than the guy you traded for, and a first-round pick, and a prospect. I think the Rangers fleeced the Bruins in that deal, and I can't say it enough. But no team in the NHL, at least in the Eastern Conference, scares me other than the Lightning and the Penguins. And you're not going to draw either of them. Well, you're not going to draw the Lightning, let me put it that way, unless something happens and you slip all the way to the 8th seed. And I doubt that you'll draw the Penguins unless they're the 7th seed, which they could be if the Flyers win the division, or you're the 7th seed and the Penguins win the division. So if you could avoid those 2 teams in the first round, I think the Flyers are set up for a first-round win. It all comes down to goalie play, and whether it's Mrazek, Elliott, or Neuwirth, or a combination of all 3, that's what it's going to come down to. But right now, if you were to say who is closer to a championship, I would say the Sixers have better top-tier talent, the Flyers have better veteran presence. I'll take the vets, and I would say the Flyers are closer to a Stanley Cup than the Sixers are to an NBA Finals. Let's step aside and we'll change gears a second time, and we'll go to the Diamond and we'll talk some baseball on the other side. We'll get ready for the Phillies' upcoming season as spring training started a few days ago. I'll kind of preview who I think is going to win each division and where the Phillies sit amongst the top-tier teams and the division winners in Major League Baseball come this 2018 season. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back on the other side. This is Trust the Podcast.
Jake Arrieta to Philly. I know. I'm sorry. It's so cliche what I just did here over the last 3 segments, but it kind of is trying to hammer home the fact that Philadelphia is in the process of making championships, or at least trying to make championship runs happen. Thanks so much for coming back with us once more for this final segment on this episode of Trust the Podcast, the first one where we didn't talk any Eagles football because, well, right now there's no Eagles football to discuss. So we will talk some Phillies baseball here. We've already gotten into the Sixers and the Flyers, so we'll get into Phillies baseball here and kind of wrap up the other 3 major sports teams in the Philadelphia market. Again, once more, if you are finding us here on PhillySportsNetwork.com, thanks so much for tuning in with us. Hope you can find some time to look at some of our other great stuff that we have all over the website, including some great articles from our Flyers, Phillies, Sixers, Eagles, Union, and college sports pages. Our whole team does a great job at getting you everything that you need to know for your Philadelphia sports teams and beyond. If you're finding us on YouTube, thanks so much for finding us here as well. If you could do me a favor quickly before we continue, if you like what you're hearing right now, leave a like and a subscribe here to our Philly Sports Network. If you like or dislike what you're hearing right now, please leave a comment down below and let me know what you want me to talk about, what you want to hear, or your thoughts on any of my thoughts so far, my misconstrued, crazy thoughts that I have going on in my mind at times. But we're going to get to something that I know more about than what I've talked about in the first 2 segments, and that's Phillies baseball. And I mentioned Jake Arrieta to Philly. It's not a done deal, just like LeBron James to Philly is not a done thing by any means. The Phillies have sent out some feelers on Jake Arrieta, and they've had what they've called mutual discussions over the last week or so to see if the righty and former Cy Young Award winner wants to come pitch in Philadelphia. Now, the latest rumor is that there are up to 6 teams who have offered or at least discussed deals with Jake Arrieta to come pitch for them in 2018. It's a little late. The market has been super weird this year, and quickly I'll kind of describe that if you're not sure what I mean by that is no free agents are getting signed. It took Yu Darvish till the end of January to get signed by the Chicago Cubs. It took J.D. Martinez till last week to get signed by the Boston Red Sox. And that was a signing that everybody in baseball almost knew was going to happen. It was really coming down to the Boston Red Sox are re-signing with the Arizona Diamondbacks. And we all know J.D. Martinez has been linked to the Red Sox for as long as we can remember. He's wanted to play there forever. So that was kind of a foregone conclusion, yet it never happened. It never materialized into anything more than a thought up until last week. Now, Yu Darvish and Jake Arrieta were going to set the pitching tone for the rest of the league. It was going to set the market for guys like Alex Cobb. It was going to set the market for guys like Chris Tillman, who's trying to make his way back to Major League dominance as he once was a few seasons ago with the Baltimore Orioles. Yet it never materialized into anything, and Jake Arrieta still sits teamless as spring training is underway. Jake Arrieta to the Phillies is an interesting pickup. And I've written in the past, I've written multiple times, and everybody has, saying that they wished that Jake Arrieta would come pitch for the Phillies. It would make them more of a contender than what they are right now. It would give them a solid 1-2 combination at the top of the rotation between Arrieta and Nola. And they're right on that. It would absolutely give the Phillies a better top of the rotation than what they have right now. Because whether it's Nola and Velasquez, whether it's Nola and Eichhoff, whether it's Nola and Lively, Eflin, Pivetta, you name it, that number 2 doesn't strike fear into the hearts of many. But you make Aaron Nola the number 2 with a guy like Jake Arrieta, now you have 40% of your games covered with solid starts. But does it make sense for the Phillies to go and sign a guy like Jake Arrieta to a big contract deal when the money doesn't really matter? Sure, it's going to be a lot of money. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 years. But the Phillies are 29th in terms of salary cap. Well, not salary cap because there is no salary cap. They're 29th in terms of player salary and their payroll for the 2018 season. they have something like 12 or 15 guys on the league minimum because they're still under that crazy rookie deal that basically gives teams your rights for 5-6 years. But outside of Carlos Santana and outside of Pat Neshek and Tommy Hunter, this team doesn't really have a lot of guys that are making a boatload of money. So the money's not a problem when you have it and you're in a league that has no salary cap and you are you were with an organization that has clearly been willing to spend money in the past. But does Jake Arrieta make sense to the Phillies right now? And to me, the answer's no. It's crazy to think that a former Cy Young winner, a guy that's perennially 200 strikeouts a year, double-digit wins of each of the last 5 seasons, doesn't make sense to a team that is in desperate need of starting pitching. But let me put it to you this way, and I wrote about this earlier in the offseason, and I'll kind of reiterate it here. The Phillies right now are in a very odd limbo. They're in a state of what I call sports purgatory. And I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I've mentioned it in a lot of my articles. Sports purgatory is the worst place to be in all of sports. Because if you're good, go and compete and win a championship. If you're bad, start your rebuild and start to get those younger pieces to ascend from the minor leagues and put a team together that way. But when you're in sports purgatory, especially in baseball, there's nowhere for you to go quickly. I think the only sport that puts you in sports purgatory more than baseball is the NBA, because you only have a 12 to 15 team roster, and in any given draft, for the most part, and of course you get your outliers, you get your Donovan Mitchells drafted late in the first round, you get your Manu Ginobili's drafted late in the second round. For the most part, the top tier talent is in the first 10 picks or less. And a lot of times, the best players go in the top 3. And then you've got 7 good players. But you don't get 7 great players, you get 3 great players. In baseball, you have such a percentage of drafting guys late in the draft that become Major League Baseball players, but those guys don't get up to the big leagues right away. Unless you're drafting Bryce Harper or Steven Strasburg or Mike Trout, the likelihood of your players getting up to the Major League level within a year is very, very small. Unless they are total studs like those 3, you're not going to get a guy to come produce for your major league team right away. So when you have a team that is in the realm of 70 to 80 wins, and you add a guy like Jake Arrieta, and you add a guy like Carlos Santana, while it makes your fans believe that you're trying to win right now, in reality, are you really? Are you really going to compete when you're a team that is projected to win currently 73 games and you add a guy like Jake Arrieta? So let's say your number 5 is going to win you 8 to 10 games a year. You bump that number 5 out of the rotation, everybody slides down 1, and Jake Arrieta becomes your ace. But Jake Arrieta is going to win you 15 to 18 games a year if he's at his best. So you're getting approximately 7 additional wins from Jake Arrieta. So now instead of being an average of 73 win team, you're an 80 or 81 win team. And 80 or 81 is, I think, better than any of our expectations coming into this season for the Phillies. But does 80 or 81 get you into the playoffs? No. I've never seen an 80 win team get into the playoffs. And neither have you, because it doesn't happen. Last year, the Minnesota Twins got in with, I believe, 85 wins. And you looked at the Twins and you said, are they really good enough to beat anybody? Are they good enough to win a series? Are they good enough to beat the Yankees in a one-game playoff where anything could happen? And the answer is no. And the answer was no, as they got bounced in the wild card game by the Yankees, who then went on to force a Game 7 against the eventual World Series champion, the Houston Astros. So it goes to tell you how good the Yankees are going to be this year if everything clicks the way it did last year. But you're an 80-win team. You're right in the middle of nothing. Because you're not good and you're not bad. You're in limbo and you're in purgatory, and that doesn't do anything for a team that's trying to build. The Sixers are a LeBron away from winning a championship. The Flyers are in a spot where their young talent is coming up and starting to make an impact and has made enough of an impact where they could make a run if everything goes their way, if they get hot at the right time. Now, are they getting hot too early? There's a possibility, but they're getting hot at the right time and putting themselves in a spot at least to make the playoffs and play some meaningful hockey in April and May. Adding Jake Arrieta to this team does not make them a playoff team. Because there are too many teams in between the Phillies and a wild card spot. And I'll tell you this right now, because I'm going to end the show with these predictions. But I'll tell you this right now. The Washington Nationals are winning the NL East again this year. Barring a crazy, unforeseen injury, multiple injuries to the Nationals, or the Mets pitching staff comes back and is just absolutely filthy. And Matt Harvey's at his best. Zach Wheeler's at his best. Noah Syndergaard's at his best. Jacob deGrom's at his best. And you've got just this unbelievable staff assembled. The Nationals are going to win the NL East. So you have to think about a wild card spot for the Phillies as their pinnacle. And in order to win a wild card spot, in order to get to game 163, you would have to be among the Arizona Diamondbacks, who probably could win 90 games again this year. The Colorado Rockies, those two were the wild card teams last year. I think the Rockies take a slight step back with no Tyler Chatwood, but they could be still a playoff team. The St. Louis Cardinals, who I am extremely high on this year, and I think could win the NL Central. The Milwaukee Brewers, who have bolstered their offense to the point where they have an excess of outfielders, which is never a bad thing. You have those four teams to compete with. The New York Mets, the aforementioned New York Mets, who, if their pitching staff again is healthy, could be a wild card team. That's 5 teams that you have to jump. At least 4 of, in order to get a playoff spot. I think the Arizona Diamondbacks are a sheer lock to at least represent the NL West in a wild card fashion. I wouldn't be surprised to see if they could beat the Dodgers out for the NL West. I don't think it's going to happen, but it could. So you have one spot for 4 teams plus you. Plus, let's, even add the San Francisco Giants in there, because the Giants have an outside chance of making a playoff run. They've added some pieces. Matt Moore is gone finally, which is kind of an addition by subtraction. You add Evan Longoria. So there are 5 teams that you would have to even just be in the mix with to make a wild card run. So this team is probably not a playoff-bound team. So what does Jake Arrieta do for you? If the Diamondbacks win 90 games, the second wild card team probably is going to have to win somewhere between 85 and 90. And like I said, the pinnacle for the Phillies this season is probably 81 and 81. Now, they might be a sly, under-the-radar pick to go to the wild card spot, but I just don't see it. And that's why if I were a betting man, I would not bet on the wow. I've talked Sixers and Flyers today, and that's what I want to say, but I would not bet on the Phillies to make the playoffs. And adding Jake Arrieta does not do that for me. It gives you a great 1-2 punch at the top of the lineup, but at the end of the day, the Phillies are not a playoff team with or without Jake Arrieta. Now, to close things out really quickly, I just kind of want to run through the division-by-division breakdown and give you my thoughts as spring training has just begun on the teams that are going to represent each division and the wildcard teams in the 2018 playoffs. Now, here's my thing. We are in spring training mode, and anything can happen in spring training. Phillies fans saw Will Middlebrooks fracture his tibia yesterday and have to be carted off the field. Now, that's not a significant loss to the Phillies. He was fighting for a major league roster spot. He may not have made the team even had he stayed healthy. But imagine that happens to a Bryce Harper, to Clayton Kershaw, to Mike Trout. And that dashes any playoff hopes, at least for the foreseeable future, of these teams. So I am going to reserve the right to come back to this in 3 or 4 weeks' time as spring training comes to an end and rebuff or rebuke anything that I said if those circumstances were to arise. If not, I'll stick with exactly what I've got and what I give you right now. But I'm putting that caveat out there because in 4 weeks' time, I'm going to come back to this. If some crazy injury happens, if a trade happens, if a free agency move happens, let's say Jake Arrieta signs with a team that is in a potential spot to make the playoffs. Let's say he signs with a Minnesota or a Los Angeles Angels or a Seattle, and they skyrocket into a playoff spot, then we'll talk later. But for me, like I said, the NL East is the Washington Nationals to lose. That pitching staff is simply too good, and if it weren't for the Mets, this might be the easiest division in all of baseball to navigate for the Nationals. But I think the Mets can hang around and maybe be a wild card team. Now, I'll get to my wild card picks in a little bit, but their pitching staff is solid enough where they could cause the Nationals some issues down the stretch, and that's why they might hang around for a little bit longer than some of the other divisions. And like I said, if it weren't for the Mets, this might be a runaway for the Nationals. It still could be. The NL Central is an interesting division this year. And by the way, if you don't want to sit and listen to me ramble about division winners, you can go and read my division winners article. It'll summarize everything you need to know very quickly. You don't have to listen to me ramble, but I hope you stick around for this last bit of the segment. The Central to me is interesting because 3 different teams could win it. Milwaukee could win it, St. Louis could win it, and Chicago could win it. I'm not going out on a limb here by picking the Cubs. The addition of Yu Darvish, even with the loss of Jake Arrieta, I still think makes them better. I would take Darvish at this point over Arrieta. But it's going to be close. And like I said, I've got some kind of love for St. Louis this year. I'm not quite sure why. But there's something about the Cardinals that really interests me. The addition of Marcell Ozuna makes that offense potent once again. If Tommy Pham and Paul DeJong could have seasons like they did last year, the Cardinals could be a really good team this year. And finally, the Brewers, like I said, have added some outfield pieces. They traded for Christian Yelich from Miami. They picked up Lorenzo Cain. Add that to Ryan Braun and Keon Broxton already in the mix, Domingo Santana and Eric Thames, who could both play first base. Santana could also play the outfield. You've got a plethora of outfielders now, and only 3 spots to put them in. You're going to have a lot of great matchups that work in your favor and have a bench piece to come and be the spell guy, to come and be a late-inning pinch hitter. The Brewers could have a good offense. Now, here is my pick. I'm taking the Cubs. That's just how it is. I'm going to take the Cubs for what it's worth. But it could be close. It could be the Cardinals. I think the Cardinals are a wild card team. Put them as my other wild card team other than the Arizona Diamondbacks. Because the Los Angeles Dodgers, I have them winning the NL West for another year, despite the fact that I think the Diamondbacks could be a legitimate team in 2018. And I think they might be better than what they were, despite not having J.D. Martinez, better than what they were last year. Their pitching staff all returns. Their bullpen, for the most part, comes back. I know they'll have to rely on Randall Delgado a little bit more than they did last year, but their bullpen is going to move to Archie Bradley being the closer. I think that's a great move for them. And adding Steven Souza Jr., that's not a bad move for the Arizona Diamondbacks. So I will take the Dodgers to win the West, the Diamondbacks as a wild card team, the St. Louis Cardinals as a wild card team as well. But like I said, I think the Phillies really have a very bleak outside shot of making a wild card run because they would have to jump Arizona, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Colorado, San Francisco, and the New York Mets just to get one of those 2 wild card spots. So the Phillies don't make the playoffs this year. It's another year of waiting for us in this summertime. They'll be better. I think they'll be much improved over last season. And like I said, I think they could win somewhere between 75 and 80 games. But not quite good enough to get into the playoffs. So I will take the Nationals, the Cubs, and the Dodgers, the Cardinals, and the Diamondbacks to go to the wild card game, and that is how I will leave the National League for now. Maybe I'll hit on the American League as things get closer, but maybe I'll break down, I should say, as things get closer. I'll give you a quick synopsis of what I think is going to happen. I'll take the Yankees in the East. I will take the Indians in the biggest blowout of the year in divisional standings. I'll take the Indians to win the Central, and I will take the Houston Astros to win the Western Division. Let's take a look at the wild card teams real quick. I think they both come out of the AL East. I like what the Angels have done. I like the Rangers. I like the Mariners. They're all going to kind of pace each other out by having to play each other so many times. I'll take the Red Sox as a lock to make it out of the AL East as a wildcard team. And I'll also take the Toronto Blue Jays. I think they've made some subtle moves in the offseason to position themselves into the playoffs. It's going to be a tough AL East. Might be the best division in baseball other than the NL Central. But I take the Blue Jays and the Red Sox as your two wild card teams. Thanks for hanging out with me today, talking some baseball, hockey, basketball. No football today, but maybe we'll get into some football as the NFL draft moves closer and we get closer to the 32nd pick in the NFL draft. Your Super Bowl champions, the Philadelphia Eagles. Thanks for listening to Trust the Podcast. We'll be back next week with plenty more. I'm your host, Tyler Zulli. Until then, have a great week.